Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist campus minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. We're continuing our sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount, Words That Change the World, studying Matthew 5 through 7. This is lesson 8 and the second video, lesson 8, and we're actually going to look at the idea of what is wealth and see if there is a Christian definition of wealth. Now, spend a couple of seconds thinking about that. Maybe hit pause button here and just see if you can come up with an idea of what is wealth. What do you think wealth is? Now, it's more than money. It's not quite power. It has something to do with assets and stuff. But see if you can come up with a good definition of wealth. I would suggest hit pause at this moment and give you a minute or two. But because in the very next slide, I go to the Merriam-Webster definition of wealth. So pause now to think about that question. And then we'll turn to Merriam-Webster definition of wealth. Looking at this third one, there's others. Wealth is like abundant supply and abundance of valuable material possessions. But looking at it more than just an amount, all property that has a money value or an exchangeable value, all material objects that have economic utility. So it's kind of our assets, those things that we can put a value on, that society in general would value as well, that we can trade for other things we desire. But from a Christian standpoint, I would actually expound on that definition a little bit. And this is kind of my amateurish pastoral definition, a somewhat arbitrary estimation of the amount of God's creation, including the human development of that creation, someone has control over it. Those parts of this world that you have in your possession, under your ownership, but that you have some say in how it is used. That is your wealth. And it ties back to the fact that ultimately it's part of God's creation that wealth is developed from, not things we necessarily possess out of context with who God is and what God has done. Now that brings, defining it that way, looking at it in attachment to God's creation, can pull us into the Genesis passage. Genesis 1:26 through 30. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the earth, birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Continuing on, and God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. This idea that God's creation, God's world is his, and he bestows it on us to rule over, to somehow have dominion, have some sort of rule over God's creation. And that rule over God's creation includes the animal and plant life. Eventually it will include land space because of how that relates to other things. It's this idea that there is some part of God's creation that is ours. Humanity was designed by God to have rule, to have dominion over God's creation. Having wealth could be seen as a partial fulfillment of our created purposes, but in a fallen world that is being restored and redeemed. So us owning and possessing things could show back to what we were originally intended to do in God's design over creation. But that question does, are those things that we possess, are we actually using them as stewards of God's creation or for our own purposes, good or bad benefits? God would rather give control over the assets in the creation into those hands that follow Jesus and use those resources for the sake of the kingdom than those who live antagonistically to God and the kingdom. Looking at this, it's like God is watching and waiting for you to ask. It's this idea that there is a created order, that God is ultimately the owner of it. He created humanity to rule over it. And the question becomes not, do we have wealth? Abject poverty leads us to there's very little that we have power or control over. Middle class has some standard of control or power over a certain number of things, and then the really wealthy has power over a lot of things in this creation. But this idea that all these things have been given to us by God, and the question is not do we have wealth, it's how we use wealth. And those of us who are reunited with God through a relationship with Jesus Christ can then look at what we have, our possessions, and use them according to their original purpose in creation to be stewards of that for God. And God is actually waiting for us as followers of Christ to ask him so that he can endow us with parts of his creation. Now, the idea is that we have to be proven good stewards of that as well by what he is, being good stewards of what he has already given us. Being faithful with a little will help us to show that we will be faithful with more, and then see that God has blessed us with that, or God just everything we have, everything we possess as wealth, as it's tied to God's creation, is a gift of God in this area. Dallas Willard outlines these three different ideas when it comes to wealth. To possess riches is to have the right to say how they will or will not be used. To use riches is to cause them to be consumed or to be transferred to others in exchange for something we desire. To trust riches is to count upon them to obtain or secure what we treasure. So when it comes to wealth, possessing, using, and trusting are three different ideas there. And a lot of people, like going back to the first video we talked about, is it good to be rich or is it good to be poor? That idea of possessing, there's really nothing good or bad with possessing any sort of amount of wealth. Now, this idea comes to how we use what we possess. And that's where it's good or bad. Or how do we use what others possess? And that's where it becomes good or bad. And then the third idea is what Jesus gets at with where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Trusting those possessions ultimately falls into what is bad for us, because our heart will then depend on our possessions, on our wealth, instead of on God. But this brings out a different idea here. We often possess resources we do not necessarily use ourselves, and we use resources that we do not possess. We can even develop an unfaithful trust in resources that we do not possess. So this idea, kind of like, you see all these books, these are my books. Now, I could just have let all these books sit in a library and use them that way. Or I could turn this into a library and allow other people to use the books I possess. And that is quite often, if I have a problem with giving books away, I also have a problem with buying books. I also kind of have a problem with libraries. So it's all three of those things when it comes to books for me. But it's this idea that using, possessing, and trusting are three different sort of ideas. Martin Luther is quoted as saying, I have had many things in my hands and I have lost them all. But whatever I have placed in God's hands, that I still possess. It's this idea that ultimately, in the way it was set up, this creation was God's and we were just stewards of it. We were just using and helping and, God's possession instead of ours. When we start to think about these things, even these books, as ours instead of God's, that's where they start slipping through our fingers, and our faithfulness becomes something less than what it should be. This can even be true of our lives. Our very lives are a resource given to us by God for our use that we neither possess nor control. Most of us either treasure or worry about our lives in a less than faith-filled way. Brings us to the famous quote by Jim Elliott. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. So even with our lives, that our most valuable treasure, the thing that comes first in the Declaration of Independence, if we try to save that, store that up, we lose it. But if we invest it, if we give our lives for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, then we will never, ever lose it. So, question on this, what types of resources are available to us that we trust will always be there and for our use? Our life could be that. I mean, I live in the US. There are tons of social structures that I just assume are always going to be there, that I use, that I don't own, but my life would be catastrophic if I lost access to them. Thinking roads, thinking, just telecommunication stuff, internet stuff, all those sorts of things. I just assume these are resources that I assume that will be there for my use, and I might treasure them more than I really should. Healthcare, just stable government sort of entities, things like that. Think about what in your life are these resources, these things that are actually wealth ideas that you use but do not possess, and do you trust them? Is your heart in the fact that the world around you consists of these sorts of resources that you can use and you go to depend upon in a way that maybe is not as faith-filled as it should be? As always, you can join these conversations in three ways: in person Sunday nights at 7 p.m., live Monday night 7 p.m. via Zoom, and these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress. I'm all over the social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Those links are in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, there's one more this week. Hit that subscribe button down below so that you can be notified when that comes out, probably tomorrow, just assuming you're watching this on the day it comes out. But I try to do 3 or 4 videos a week that you can always kind of pick up if you're subscribed. Loved having this conversation with you. Hope it continues again real soon.